fix this helicopter and I'll marry you right now." The voice cut through the hangar like a blade through silk. Marcus Reed looked up from his toolbox, grease still coating his fingers from the landing gear assembly he'd been inspecting. His eyes landed on the Bell 429, sitting under the harsh floodlights, its engine cowling open like a surgical wound, exposed and vulnerable. Victoria Sterling stood 20 feet away, arms crossed tightly across her chest, surrounded by a cluster of engineers in pressed white shirts carrying expensive tablets. Her gaze swept over his worn mechanic's coveralls, lingering on the oil stains that had become permanent fixtures and the frayed cuffs that spoke of years of hard work. "You like staring at helicopters," she said, her voice sharp with barely concealed condescension, "or are you just pretending you understand what you're looking at?" Soft, uncomfortable laughter rippled through the group of engineers gathered behind her. Someone whispered something about maintenance guys having delusions of competence. Another made a joke about janitors thinking they were rocket scientists. Marcus said nothing. He just looked at the helicopter with those calm, assessing eyes, then back at his toolbox, then at the woman who'd just publicly mocked him. But the next time he looked up, it wasn't to stare in admiration. It was to fix what everyone else in that room, with all their degrees and credentials and expensive educations, had completely missed. Victoria Sterling was aviation royalty in every sense that mattered. Her grandfather had founded Sterling Aviation from a single corrugated metal hangar in upstate New York back in 1962, when helicopters were still considered dangerous novelties rather than essential tools. Her father had transformed that modest operation into a global powerhouse, manufacturing civilian helicopters for medical transport, corporate travel, search and rescue operations, and emergency services across 43 countries on 6 continents. Victoria herself had graduated summa cum laude from MIT at 21 with dual degrees in aerospace engineering and business management, completing a thesis on rotorcraft aerodynamics that was still cited in academic journals. She'd earned her helicopter pilot's license at 16, making her the youngest certified pilot in New York State that year. By 28, she was running day-to-day operations for the entire company. At 32, when her father suffered a catastrophic stroke during a routine board meeting, collapsing mid-sentence while discussing quarterly projections, she'd stepped into the CEO role without missing a single deadline or losing a single contract. The aviation press called her the Iron Lady of rotorcraft manufacturing. The business magazines called her ruthless, brilliant, uncompromising. She'd never bothered to correct any of them because they weren't wrong. She lived alone in a carefully curated minimalist penthouse on the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the Hudson River. No pets that required feeding and attention. No plants that needed watering and care. No photographs cluttering the clean surfaces. No family portraits. No vacation snapshots. No reminders of a past she'd systematically organized away. Just clean lines, designer furniture selected by an interior decorator she'd met with exactly once, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the sprawling city below look small and manageable and under control. She woke at exactly 4:45 every morning, ran 8 miles along the waterfront regardless of weather conditions, rain, snow, summer heat, winter ice, and was at her desk reviewing overnight reports from manufacturing facilities in Germany, Brazil, Singapore, and Australia by 6:30 sharp. She had exactly 4 numbers saved in her personal phone: her executive assistant, who managed her impossible schedule, her corporate lawyer, who handled the endless legal complexities of international manufacturing, her father's private nurse, who provided daily updates on his condition, and the chairman of the board, who she reported to quarterly. That was sufficient. That was all she needed. Her romantic history consisted of 3 relationships, all with men who worked in adjacent industries: a defense contractor, an airline executive, a venture capitalist who specialized in aerospace startups. All 3 had ended exactly the same way, with the men calling her emotionally unavailable, cold, married to her work, incapable of real connection. She'd never argued with their assessments. They weren't wrong. She attended charity galas in designer gowns that cost more than most people's monthly rent, gave keynote speeches at prestigious aerospace conferences where men twice her age called her Miss Sterling, with barely concealed resentment in their voices, and made decisions that affected thousands of jobs across multiple continents without any visible emotion or hesitation. She'd fired 19 executives in 8 years as CEO. None of them had seen it coming. She didn't believe in warnings or second chances. She believed in results, in performance metrics, in quarterly projections that either met expectations or didn't. Her life was measured in contracts signed, deadlines met, competitors outmaneuvered, market share gained, stock prices that climbed steadily upward under her leadership, and she told herself this was enough. This was success. This was what her grandfather had built, what her father had expanded, what she was protecting and growing. She told herself the emptiness didn't matter. Marcus Reed had lived an entirely different kind of story. He'd been a senior rotary wing maintenance officer in the United States Marine Corps, stationed primarily at forward operating bases in Helmand Province of Afghanistan during the worst years of the conflict. For 6 brutal years, he'd kept Hueys and Cobras and aging CH-53s flying in conditions that would make civilian engineers quit on their first day, sandstorms that stripped paint off fuselages, temperatures that ranged from 120 degrees during the day to below freezing at night, combat damage from small arms fire, and RPGs that required immediate field repairs under impossible circumstances. He could rebuild a transmission using only hand tools and a headlamp, working by feel in the dark when the generator failed. He'd once restarted a downed helicopter using a truck battery and wire scavenged from a destroyed communications post, jury-rigging a solution that kept the aircraft flying long enough to evacuate wounded Marines. He'd been decorated twice for actions that went beyond normal duty. He'd been recommended for promotion 3 times. His commanding officers had written evaluation reports that used words like indispensable and exceptional and the finest maintenance officer I've ever had the privilege of commanding. His wife Jennifer had been a 3rd-grade teacher at an elementary school in North Carolina, near Camp Lejeune, where he'd been stationed between deployments. They'd met at a VA support group for families dealing with deployment stress. She was warm where he was reserved, patient where he was intense, the kind of person who genuinely remembered everyone's birthday and left encouraging notes tucked into unexpected places: his lunch bag, his truck's sun visor, the pocket of his uniform. They'd had a son together, Dylan, born on a clear morning in April with his mother's eyes and his father's serious, observant nature. But after Dylan was born, something went terribly wrong. Jennifer developed severe postpartum psychosis that manifested slowly at first: trouble sleeping, anxiety, intrusive thoughts, then spiraled into full delusions and paranoia that convinced her everyone was in danger, that terrible things were about to happen, that the only way to protect Dylan was to remove herself from his life permanently. Marcus took emergency leave from the Corps. He tried everything: specialists who prescribed different medications, inpatient psychiatric care, constant supervision, family therapy. But one afternoon while he was at the grocery store buying formula and diapers, thinking Jennifer was safe with her mother watching Dylan, she'd gotten in her car and driven to a bridge over the Cape Fear River. Dylan was 11 months old when his mother jumped. Marcus left the military 3 weeks after the funeral. He couldn't return to a world that demanded absolute focus and total commitment when his infant son needed a present, attentive father who wouldn't disappear for 6-month deployments. Now, 9 years later, Marcus worked as a senior mechanic at Sterling Aviation's primary manufacturing facility in upstate New York. The job paid enough to cover rent on a modest 2-bedroom apartment, Dylan's school expenses, extracurricular activities, and the twice-monthly therapy sessions they both still attended to process the loss they'd experienced. The hours were perfect for single parenthood. He worked the day shift, 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., which let him drop Dylan off at school every morning and pick him up every afternoon, help with homework, make dinner together, maintain the routines and stability that experts said were crucial for children who'd experienced early trauma. No one at Sterling Aviation knew he'd once briefed Marine Corps generals on aircraft readiness rates. No one knew he still carried his old field toolkit in the truck bed, wrapped carefully in canvas like a relic from another life he'd left behind. No one knew he'd turned down lucrative job offers from defense contractors because they all required travel, long hours, the kind of commitment that meant missing Dylan's school plays and soccer games and science fairs. To his coworkers, he was just Marcus, the reliable guy who could fix things when the expensive engineers with their fancy degrees couldn't figure out what was wrong, the quiet mechanic who kept to himself and never talked about his past. And that was exactly how Marcus wanted it: invisible, unremarkable, safe. Dylan was everything that mattered now, 9 years old, obsessed with space exploration and coding and robotics, and asking endless questions like, "Dad, do you think we'll actually live on Mars in my lifetime? And how do ion engines work differently from chemical rockets?" Every morning, Dylan made him promise to come home safe, a ritual that had started when Dylan was 5 and learned that some dads didn't always come home. Every night, Marcus read to him from books about astronauts and deep-sea explorers and scientists who changed the world through persistence and intelligence. Dylan had Jennifer's expressive eyes and Marcus's stubborn determination to understand exactly how everything worked, to take things apart and figure out the underlying principles and put them back together better than before. The kid was building a model rocket for the county science fair, a project he'd been working on for 3 solid months at the community center's STEM lab. Not just a simple kit rocket, but something he'd designed himself. Custom fins based on aerodynamic calculations, a payload bay that would carry sensors to measure altitude and acceleration, a recovery system he'd engineered to bring everything back intact. The STEM lab coordinator had told Marcus that Dylan's project was remarkably sophisticated for his age group, that he was working at a level comparable to high school students, that he had genuine potential if he could get access to proper resources and mentorship. But 2 weeks ago, the lab had been abruptly shut down. The official explanation kept changing. Budget cuts, then electrical repairs that couldn't wait, then vague mentions of safety concerns that were never quite explained. The community center director stopped returning Marcus's calls. Dylan had adapted the way resilient kids do when adults fail them. He'd moved his entire operation home, working at their small kitchen table under a cheap desk lamp with tools Marcus bought from the hardware store, recalculating his designs to work with more limited resources, never once complaining about the unfairness of the situation. "It's okay, Dad," he'd said with 9-year-old stoicism. "I can still finish it. It just might take a little longer." But no 9-year-old should have to finish a science project in inadequate lighting with improvised tools because adults couldn't keep a community program running. Marcus had called the community center director 3 times, left detailed voicemails explaining the situation, Dylan's project, the upcoming deadline for the science fair. No one ever called back. So when Victoria Sterling made her public challenge in front of the assembled engineers, offering marriage as a prize for fixing her broken helicopter, Marcus didn't think about his wounded pride or the unfairness of being mocked for his job title. He thought about Dylan working at that kitchen table with the flickering desk lamp, trying to solder circuit connections he could barely see, refusing to give up even when every advantage had been taken away from him. And he thought, if fixing this helicopter means getting that lab reopened, getting Dylan access to proper equipment and lighting, and the fair chance he deserves, then I'll fix it even if it costs me everything I have left. 3 days before the incident that would change both their lives, the Bell 429 had developed an intermittent ignition fault during final testing before delivery to the client. The helicopter would start perfectly some attempts, then refuse to ignite on others with no apparent pattern. The diagnostics showed absolutely nothing wrong. Every sensor reading normal, every system parameter within acceptable ranges, every component testing perfectly in isolation. But put it all together, turn the key, and sometimes the engine would roar to life flawlessly. Other times, nothing but the grinding of the starter motor and the smell of unburned fuel. Engineers from MIT, Stanford, and Oxford had been brought in at considerable expense. They'd spent 72 hours running every diagnostic protocol in the extensive manual. They'd replaced components systematically, searching for the faulty part. They'd recalibrated sensors with precision instruments. They'd checked and double-checked and triple-checked every single system. Nothing worked. The fault remained completely intermittent and utterly inexplicable. This wasn't just any helicopter causing problems. It was the prototype demonstration unit for a $60 million contract with a European medical transport consortium that operated emergency helicopters across 12 countries. If this aircraft didn't fly flawlessly during the scheduled demonstration, the contract would die immediately. And if that contract died, Sterling Aviation would lose 3 additional deals worth another $80 million combined that were contingent on successfully delivering this first unit. Dominoes, $140 million in contracts, 300 jobs across 2 facilities, the company's reputation for reliability that Victoria had spent 8 years building. Victoria stood in the center of the hangar, jaw muscles tight with tension, hands clasped behind her back in a posture that projected control even as frustration churned inside her. Failure wasn't an option, she accepted. Her entire reputation was built on precision, reliability, never missing a deadline regardless of obstacles. That's when she noticed him. Marcus Reed, standing near the maintenance bay holding his toolbox, ostensibly there to perform routine inspections on other equipment. But he wasn't working. He was staring at the Bell 429 with an intensity that seemed completely inconsistent with his job description and rank. His eyes moved across the engine cowling with laser focus, his head tilting slightly as if he were listening to something no one else could hear, his expression showing the kind of deep concentration that looked out of place on a mechanic's face. Victoria felt something flicker in her chest. Irritation at the distraction, maybe, or curiosity about what he thought he was seeing. She walked over deliberately, heels clicking sharply on the concrete floor. The engineers fell silent immediately, watching their CEO approach the maintenance guy with obvious interest. She stopped exactly 10 feet from him, close enough to make her point, far enough to maintain professional distance. "You," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hangar. Marcus looked up slowly. His face was calm, weathered from years of outdoor work, completely unreadable. "Yes, ma'am?" Victoria gestured toward the Bell 429 with one perfectly manicured hand. "You've been staring at my helicopter for 15 minutes straight. See something my engineers with their advanced degrees and expensive consulting contracts don't?" A few of the engineers smirked at the implied mockery. One whispered something to another that made them both chuckle quietly. Someone in the back made a comment about mechanics having delusions of competence that drew more suppressed laughter. Victoria didn't smile. She just kept her sharp eyes fixed on Marcus, waiting for him to back down, to apologize for wasting time, to return to his appropriate station. Instead, he just looked at her calmly, then back at the helicopter, then back to her face. "Tell you what," Victoria said, her voice dropping to that particular tone of cold precision that made executives across 3 continents nervous. "Fix this helicopter that my team of highly educated engineers can't figure out, and I'll marry you right now, right here, in front of everyone in this building." The hangar went completely, utterly silent. Someone's tablet notification beeped in the stillness. No one moved to silence it. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't show surprise or excitement or fear. He just looked at her with those steady, measuring eyes. "And if I can't?" His voice was quiet, but it carried. Victoria's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then you're fired. Immediately. No severance package, no final paycheck. Security escorts you out of this facility within the hour, and you never work in aviation again. I'll personally ensure that." She crossed her arms across her chest. "Do we have a deal?" One of the senior engineers, a man in his 50s wearing a Stanford-class ring that caught the light, spoke up hesitantly. "Miss Sterling, with all due respect, he's a mechanic. He doesn't have security clearance to touch prototype systems. We could have liability issues if I'm completely aware of what he is and what our insurance policies cover." Her tone cut him off as cleanly as a scalpel. She didn't take her eyes off Marcus. "Do we have a deal?" Marcus looked at her for a long, measuring moment. He thought about Dylan sitting at their kitchen table with that inadequate desk lamp, trying to finish a science project that deserved proper equipment. About the closed STEM lab that should have been open. About his son's face when he said, "It's okay, Dad. I can make it work," in that voice that tried so hard to sound brave. About Jennifer. About the bridge. About the promise he'd made at her funeral that their son would never lack for anything Marcus could possibly provide. Then he set down his toolbox with deliberate care. "I'll need 2 hours," he said quietly. Victoria checked her watch with theatrical precision. "You have 90 minutes, clock starts now." She turned and walked toward her office without another word, heels clicking rhythmically on concrete, back straight, not looking back to see if he'd actually attempt it. The engineers dispersed slowly, muttering among themselves in low voices. A few stayed to watch the entertainment, expecting to see the mechanic fail spectacularly and provide something to talk about at lunch. Marcus stood alone beside the Bell 429, the prototype that represented millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs. He looked at his watch. 10:47 a.m. 90 minutes meant 12:17 p.m. deadline. He thought about the last real conversation he'd had with Jennifer, 3 days before she died. She'd been sitting on their couch staring at nothing, and she'd said in that flat, effectless voice, "I'm sorry I can't be the mother he deserves. I'm broken. Everything I touch breaks." Marcus had held her hands and told her with absolute conviction, "You're exactly the mother he deserves. You're brilliant and kind and strong. You just need time and help. We'll get through this together." But time had run out before the help could work. Now Dylan asked about his mom sometimes, with careful 9-year-old questions. Marcus told him stories about how smart Jennifer had been, how she'd remembered every student's name and specific challenges, how much she'd loved reading and teaching and helping kids discover that learning could be exciting. He never told Dylan about the bridge, about the police officer's voice on the phone, about identifying her body, about the sound he'd made when they told him there'd been witnesses but no one had been close enough to stop her. Dylan didn't need those images in his head. He needed to know his mother had loved him completely and that his father would never ever leave. So Marcus walked deliberately to his truck in the parking lot, unlocked the weatherproof toolbox bolted in the bed, and pulled out the canvas-wrapped bundle he'd kept hidden there for 9 years like a secret part of his identity. His old field toolkit, military-grade precision instruments that had kept helicopters flying through sandstorms and combat in conditions that would destroy civilian aircraft. Some he'd purchased with deployment pay. Some he'd fabricated himself in machine shops on forward operating bases, custom tools designed for specific impossible repairs. Some he'd won in poker games or traded for or received as gifts from fellow Marines who understood what these tools represented. He'd told himself 100 times he should sell them, that he didn't need them anymore, that he'd left that life behind when he became a full-time father, but he'd never been able to let them go. He carried the bundle back to the hangar, set it on the floor beside the Bell 429, and unrolled it slowly and carefully.
The tools gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, torque wrenches calibrated to precise specifications, specialty screwdrivers, a digital multimeter that had survived 3 deployments, inspection cameras and precision measuring instruments, and custom pieces that existed nowhere else. He picked up the first tool, a ratchet wrench with a custom grip he'd wrapped himself using paracord and electrical tape, designed to work perfectly even with gloves on in freezing conditions. It fit in his hand like it had never left. And for the first time in 9 years, Marcus Reed stopped pretending to be someone else. He became an engineer again.
Marcus started by removing the engine cowling completely. 12 bolts, each requiring a specific torque sequence to avoid warping the aluminum housing. He worked quickly, but with absolute precision, his hands moving with the unconscious muscle memory of 1,000 similar operations performed under every possible condition. The engineers who'd stayed to watch exchanged significant glances. This wasn't the uncertain fumbling of an amateur trying to look competent. This was genuine expertise, practiced skill that couldn't be faked. Within 10 minutes, the cowling was completely off, set aside carefully on a clean tarp he'd pulled from his maintenance cart to protect the expensive finish. He disconnected the electrical harness feeding into the ignition system, 18 color-coded connections that looked identical to anyone unfamiliar with military wiring standards, which differed significantly from civilian aerospace protocols in ways most engineers never learned. Then he carefully extracted the ignition module itself, a complex piece of engineering designed to manage precise timing and fuel delivery under varying conditions. Removing it required detaching 3 separate sensor arrays and 2 hydraulic connections. One wrong move, one stripped thread, and he'd damage components worth tens of thousands of dollars and make the situation catastrophically worse. He worked slowly here, methodically, checking each connection twice before touching it. At 11:04 a.m., 43 minutes gone, he lifted the ignition module free and carried it to a nearby workbench. He opened it using a specialized tool from his kit, something he'd modified himself years ago for field repairs on different equipment, but which worked perfectly for this application. Inside, he found exactly what he'd suspected, what the expensive diagnostic computers had completely missed: microfractures in the ceramic insulation surrounding the primary ignition coil, completely invisible to standard testing protocols, undetectable by sensors, caused by repeated thermal cycling, the engine heating during operation and cooling afterward, hundreds of cycles that gradually weakened the ceramic material at a microscopic level. It wouldn't show up on any computerized diagnostic. It was a pure physical failure that only manifested under specific load conditions and temperature ranges, which explained the intermittent nature perfectly. He'd seen it exactly once before on a Huey in Afghanistan that had flown too many consecutive missions in extreme temperature variations, 120 degrees during day operations, below freezing at night, the constant expansion and contraction, eventually creating failure points that no amount of sensor monitoring could detect. He pulled a replacement coil from the facility's spare parts inventory, standard issue component, available in any well-stocked facility, nothing special required. But the installation required precision calibration that civilian technicians wouldn't know because it wasn't in any manual. It was field knowledge, learned through necessity in places where failure meant Marines didn't come home. He installed the new coil, calibrated the timing manually using a technique he developed himself during deployment, working by feel and experience rather than following documented procedures. At 11:52 a.m., he reconnected the final electrical connection in the harness. Every single connection had to be perfect. Wrong polarity, inadequate connection, any small error would cause immediate catastrophic failure. By 12:09 p.m., 8 minutes before his deadline, he was torquing the final bolt on the engine cowling back into position. The engineers had returned, more of them now. Word had spread through the facility that something interesting was happening in the main hangar. Victoria appeared at exactly 12:15 p.m., 4 minutes past the deadline, but well within any reasonable interpretation of 90 minutes. She said nothing, just stood there with her arms crossed, face completely unreadable, surrounded by her engineers. Marcus wiped his hands carefully on a clean rag from his toolkit. He looked directly at her. Try it now. Victoria walked to the pilot's door, climbed into the seat with practiced ease, reached for the ignition. The entire hangar fell completely silent, 50 people holding their breath. She turned the key. The starter motor engaged immediately. The turbine began to spin, smoothly, powerfully, without hesitation. The rotor blades shuddered once, then began their rotation, accelerating to operational speed with perfect precision. The engine roared to life, flawless and powerful, filling the massive hangar with sound. The Bell 429 lifted 6 inches off the ground, hovered there absolutely steady with no wobble or drift, then settled back down gently as Victoria reduced collective. She shut off the engine. The rotors slowed gradually and stopped. Silence fell again, deeper than before. Victoria climbed out of the cockpit, walked deliberately over to Marcus, and stopped exactly 3 feet in front of him. Everyone was watching now. Phones were out, recording, waiting to see if the legendary Ice Queen of Aviation would actually marry the mechanic in front of the entire company. Marcus pulled off his work gloves slowly and looked her directly in the eye. "I don't need your marriage proposal," he said quietly, but his voice carried across the silent hangar. Victoria froze completely. Something flickered behind her carefully controlled expression. Confusion, maybe surprise, possibly the first genuine emotion anyone had seen from her in years. Marcus wiped a streak of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. "I just need the STEM lab at Dylan's community center reopened and properly funded. He has a science fair project due in 2 weeks. He's been working in inadequate lighting with improvised tools for the past 14 days. That's all I want. Just the lab reopened with proper equipment, so my son can finish what he started and have the same fair chance as every other kid." The silence stretched impossibly long. "Who's Dylan?" Victoria's voice was softer than anyone had ever heard it, genuinely asking rather than demanding. "My son. He's 9 years old." Marcus met her eyes without flinching or looking away. "He's building a model rocket with custom aerodynamics and sensor packages he programmed himself. He's smarter than I'll ever be. He deserves proper equipment and mentorship and a fair shot at succeeding. That's all I'm asking for. Not money, not recognition, not a promotion, just lights and equipment so a kid can finish his science project." Victoria felt something tighten painfully in her chest, a feeling she genuinely hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. Shame, real, actual shame. Not the performative kind she'd learned to fake at board meetings when someone accused her of being ruthless or heartless. Real shame that made your throat close and your stomach clench and your carefully constructed self-image crack and crumble. She'd used this man as entertainment, made his considerable skill into a public spectacle, turned his professional dignity into a bet for the amusement of engineers who'd spent 3 days failing to accomplish what he'd done in 90 minutes. And he hadn't done any of it for recognition or reward or her attention. He'd done it for a 9-year-old boy building robots in the dark because the adults running the community center couldn't keep a basic program running. "Done," Victoria said, and the word came out rougher than she intended, almost harsh. "The lab will be open and fully funded by tonight. You have my word on that." Marcus nodded once. He didn't smile, didn't thank her effusively, didn't celebrate, just nodded with quiet dignity and turned back to gather his tools. Victoria stood there for another long moment, then turned and walked away, heels echoing in the silence. Back in her office, she closed the door and pulled up his personnel file on her computer. Marcus Reed, employee ID 8841, senior mechanic, hired 9 years ago. She clicked deeper into the employment records. Education, Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering, Georgia Institute of Technology, GPA 3.8, Dean's List every semester, military service, United States Marine Corps, Aviation Maintenance Division 2012-2018, rank at discharge Chief Warrant Officer 3, specialty, rotary wing aircraft maintenance and field repair, commendations, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, 2 awards, Meritorious Service Medal, Joint Service Achievement Medal, Combat Action Ribbon, reason for leaving service, personal family matter, approved hardship discharge. Victoria stared at the screen, reading and rereading those dry official phrases that represented a life completely different from what she'd assumed. Then she picked up her phone and dialed the community center's director. "This is Victoria Sterling from Sterling Aviation. The STEM lab at your facility will reopen tonight. I'm personally funding all electrical repairs, equipment upgrades, and operational costs for the next 5 years. I don't care what it costs. I want it done by 6 p.m. today. Miss Sterling, that's extraordinarily generous, but I should explain the budget situation. Tonight, 6 p.m., not negotiable. If you can't make that happen, I'll buy the entire building and hire someone who can." She hung up before the director could respond. Then she sat back in her expensive leather chair and stared at nothing, feeling something she couldn't quite name but that felt uncomfortably like being genuinely authentically human for the first time in years. The following week, Dylan won first place at the county science fair. His rocket flew higher and straighter than any other entry, reaching an altitude of 1,447 feet, verified by the onboard sensors he'd programmed before deploying its recovery system and landing intact, less than 50 yards from the launch pad. The judges called it remarkably sophisticated for his age group and demonstrating advanced understanding of aerodynamics and engineering principles. Victoria attended the science fair. She sat in the back row wearing jeans and a plain sweater. No designer clothes, no makeup, no jewelry, no corporate armor. Just another parent in a crowd of parents celebrating kids' achievements. She watched Dylan's face absolutely light up with pure joy when they called his name for first place. Watched Marcus lift him onto his shoulders while Dylan held the trophy high above his head like a championship boxer. grinning with the unself-conscious happiness that only 9-year-olds can achieve. And Victoria felt something she genuinely hadn't felt in years, maybe since before her mother died, real joy, not the cold satisfaction of closing a profitable deal or beating a competitor. Real joy, warm and uncomplicated and human. After the ceremony, Dylan came running up to her with that trophy clutched in both hands. "Are you my dad's boss?" he asked with 9-year-old directness. Victoria crouched down to his eye level, her expensive jeans getting dusty on the gymnasium floor. "Sort of. Are you his girlfriend?" Dylan's eyes were bright with curiosity. Victoria froze completely. She looked over at Marcus, who was standing a few feet away, trying very hard not to laugh at her obvious discomfort. "No," she said carefully, choosing words precisely. "Just a friend." "Oh," Dylan looked genuinely disappointed. "I thought you were pretty, and Dad needs a girlfriend. He gets lonely." Victoria's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thank you, Dylan. I think you're absolutely brilliant." Dylan grinned huge and unself-conscious, then ran back to show his dad something complicated on a tablet screen. Marcus walked over slowly. "Sorry about that. He's been asking a lot of questions lately about relationships and families." "It's completely fine," Victoria said, and realized she was smiling for real. "He's wonderful." "Yeah, he really is." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching Dylan excitedly explain his rocket's design to other kids. A week later, Victoria called Marcus into her office. She offered him a position as chief engineering consultant, full benefits package, salary triple what he was currently making, signing bonus, company car, the kind of offer that most people would accept instantly. He turned it down. "I genuinely appreciate the offer," he said carefully. "But I'm happy where I am. The current job lets me be there for Dylan every single day. Drop him off, pick him up, help with homework, make dinner together. That's what matters to me now. That's what I need to be doing." Victoria didn't argue or try to convince him. For the first time in her entire professional life, she understood that success wasn't always measured in job titles and salary numbers. But something fundamental had changed between them, shifted in ways neither of them had planned or expected. Marcus started staying a few extra minutes after his shift ended, just to talk. Victoria started arriving at the facility earlier in the morning to catch him before he started his day. They talked about helicopters and engineering challenges, about Dylan's endless questions and projects, about nothing particularly important and everything that mattered, and slowly, carefully, without either of them planning it or acknowledging it openly, something real began to grow between them. 2 months later, Victoria was scheduled to observe a test flight of the Bell 429 before final delivery to the European client. She arrived at the flight line early and found Marcus coordinating the ground crew, wearing a flight suit with a safety vest over it instead of his usual mechanic's coveralls. "I thought you turned down the consulting position," she said, genuinely surprised. Marcus looked up and smiled slightly. "I did turn down the full-time position, but they asked me to review safety protocols for test flights as a temporary contractor. I said yes to that." "Why the change?" "Because Dylan asked me if I was ever going to fly again. I told him I didn't need to anymore." He said, "But Dad, you love helicopters, you love flying, why would you give that up?" Marcus's smile widened. He was right. Turns out you can't hide anything from 9-year-olds who pay attention. Victoria laughed, a real genuine laugh that felt completely unfamiliar and absolutely wonderful. After the flight, successful and flawless, the Bell 429 performing perfectly, she found Marcus near the aircraft conducting post-flight inspection. The sun was setting, casting gold and orange light across the tarmac, making the helicopter's polished surface gleam. She walked up to him slowly. "Do you remember what I said that day in the hangar?" she asked quietly. "About the marriage proposal?" "Yeah, I remember. I didn't mean it. It was cruel and dismissive, and I used you as entertainment. I'm genuinely sorry for that." "I know you are." Victoria looked up at him, her heart beating faster than any board meeting had ever made it beat. "But I'd like to make a different offer now." "What's that?" "I'd like the first kiss to be because I love you, not because you fixed something or won a bet, just because I love you and I think maybe you might love me too." Marcus's breath caught audibly. He looked at her, really looked, seeing past the CEO armor to the person underneath who'd spent her whole life building walls and was finally carefully ready to let them fall. He reached out and took her hand gently. "Are you sure about this?" She nodded, eyes bright. "I've never been more sure of anything in my entire life." The Bell 429 sat behind them, silent in the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called across the empty tarmac. Marcus leaned down slowly. Victoria rose up on her toes, and they kissed, softly, carefully, like something precious, neither wanted to break. Not because of a bet, not because of a challenge or a contract or any transaction, but because somewhere between the engine repair and the apology,
Between the son's science project and the dream of second chances, two people who'd survived impossible losses had found a way to be whole again. When they pulled apart, Victoria rested her forehead against his chest. Dylan's going to be absolutely insufferable about this. Marcus laughed, the sound rumbling in his chest. Yay, he's going to say he knew all along and that he planned the whole thing. He probably did. He's smarter than both of us. Definitely smarter than me. They stood there in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria Sterling felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not in a boardroom negotiating contracts, not in a penthouse overlooking a city she'd conquered, but here, standing on a tarmac with grease-stained hands holding hers, with a 9-year-old boy waiting at home who'd asked if she was pretty, with a future that looked nothing like the controlled, perfect plan she'd spent decades building. It looked better. It looked real. It looked like home. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. Want to come over for dinner? Dylan's making spaghetti. Well, attempting to make spaghetti. There will probably be a lot of sauce on the ceiling. Victoria smiled. Genuine and warm. I'd love that. They walked toward his truck together, hands still intertwined, the Bell 429 gleaming behind them in the last light of day. Somewhere above them, a helicopter passed overhead, running lights blinking against the twilight, heading home, just like they were.